The funding for this program is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and the Friends of 4, 10, and 12.
A new public opinion survey is good news for Democrat Richard Stallings in his bid to unseat incumbent Congressman George Hansen, and it reveals a citizenry split over the wilderness issue. Good evening, I'm Jean McNeil. Mark Johnson is on assignment today. Democratic challenger Richard Stallings holds about a 2-to-1 lead over incumbent Republican Congressman George Hansen, according to a survey released today by Marcept Research, Idaho Public Television, and the Idaho Statesman. The same poll gives incumbent Republican Senator James McClure a better than 2-to-1 edge over Democratic candidate Pete Bush. The Idaho Opinion Survey is conducted regularly by the three sponsoring organizations. The first edition concentrated mainly on education and tax issues, and it showed strong support for both more money and reform in Idaho's public schools. This time, we asked respondents for their choices in the November election, and we questioned them about wilderness and about the economy. Tom Brown is the president of Marcept Consulting and Research here in Boise. His firm designed and conducted our survey, and he's here with us tonight to help analyze the results. Welcome, Mr. Brown.
Thank you.
Can you tell us a little bit first about how you went about designing and conducting this survey?
Sure, Jean. Our data collection staff completed interviews by telephone during the period May 31st through June 5th, and interviews were completed among 360 Idahoans. And we used 10 separate random samples to ensure that all telephone households had an equal probability of being selected. And we ended up with 49% men, 51% women in the sample, and based on the sample size, we have what we call a tolerance or a confidence level of plus or minus 3.6 percentage points to 5.5 percentage points on any one question.
Just elaborate for a moment on what that means.
Well, that means that the percentages would vary in those ranges if we could, by chance, interview all Idahoans.
So a percent might be as much as 3.7% one way or the other,
right,
or in some questions 5.
That's right.
Yeah. How do you think that the survey, from what you can tell, matches the population? Pretty confident about it?
Yes, I am. I think that as we get into the results, we can see that it does accurately reflect, in our view, the opinion of Idahoans on the political races and the wilderness issue and others.
Okay, let's take a look at some of those results. The survey's most dramatic result came when we asked residents of the 2nd District who said that they were likely to vote, if the election were held today, whether they would vote for Republican George Hansen or Democrat Richard Stallings. More than half, about 57%, said they would vote for the Democrat, Richard Stallings. Roughly 26% said they'd vote for the incumbent Republican, George Hansen. And about 16% said they hadn't made up their minds. Tom, that's a fairly substantial difference, is it not? How confident can we be about that?
Well, we can be pretty confident, and let me set the stage a little bit for you. As I think you mentioned, likely voters only were asked the voting questions. And then interviewing was conducted prior to Hansen's sentencing and his reprimand by the Congressional Ethics Committee.
So it was not done essentially then in the wake of some immediate news story?
That's correct. We think there were pretty stable conditions as far as public opinion goes. And our sample is sufficiently large, and the preference difference is so great to allow us to say that if all possible combinations of sampling variation went in Hansen's favor, we are still 95% certain that he trailed Stallings by at least 15 percentage points.
So even if every sampling error possible had occurred,
right,
that would still be still be the situation. That, despite the fact that the number of respondents in the 2nd District is, of course, smaller than the number in the state as a whole.
That is true. Mm-hmm.
What can we say about some of the demographic breakdowns of this, where Hansen's strengths and weaknesses are, mm-hmm, where Stallings are?
Okay, fine. Well, Stallings' strength at the time of the survey was rather widespread. We find that he pulls 88% of the Democrats, and partly because Democrats have an older age profile, Stallings' strength increases significantly among middle-aged and elderly Idahoans.
Because Democrats tend to be a little older.
And that's true. Mm-hmm. And Hansen's weakness is sufficiently widespread to have eroded a major share of his Republican support. Hansen polls only 48% of the Republicans, and for a reference point, we can look to how McClure did in the Senate race, and we see that he polled 90% of the Republicans. So there was a real difference there. And then when we turn to religious affiliation, we find that it's a dead heat among LDS voters, who in fact comprise 52% of our 2nd District sample, and that dead heat put them at both 40.5% each.
They split the vote right down the
That's
middle.
right. Mhm. And then by region, Hansen's greatest strength is in Idaho Falls, where he polls 34%, and this is in contrast to his extreme weakness among Ada County voters, where he polled only 6%. And other minor trends give some indication that Stallings polls best among men and those who have above-average incomes.
So fairly consistent strength for Hansen in most demographic groups.
For Stallings.
I mean,
yes.
Excuse me, for Stallings.
Yes, that's
Spoke
right.
myself. We'll get some reaction on that, and we'll come back to some other things. Congressman Hansen was not available for comment today, but producer Paula Whistle in Pocatello was able to talk with Hansen's challenger. Stallings was cautious. He said he would continue to run the campaign as if he were 5 percentage points behind, but the news clearly did make him happy.
We're very pleased with the results, and I think it shows that our campaign is bearing fruit. I think it's the results of a lot of hard work on our part and the response of people who are pleased with the way we're running our campaign.
What do you think this will do for your campaign? Is it going to be a boost to it?
Yes, obviously any evidence that you have that you're ahead helps, but it won't change our strategy. We will continue to be into every county. I will be in every parade. I'll do what has to be done to meet as many people in the 2nd District, and I'm very pleased. I think this does show that our campaign is being well received, and that I'm being perceived as a positive candidate, and so I see this as a result of a pro-Stallings rather than an anti-Hansen.
As I said, we were not able to talk with Hansen today, but producer Gary Richardson did talk with a number of Republicans at their convention in Sun Valley, most of whom defended George Hansen's political strength.
Well, the rest of the survey showed that Reagan, McClure, Craig are all leading, and I think that the people of Idaho, when they get in the election booth, will still vote for Congressman Hansen. Who would you rather have representing you and representing President Reagan, Stallings or Hansen? It comes back as simple as that.
The majority of the people over in the district in which I represent are still very strong supporters of George Hansen.
Surveys this far ahead of election have very little validity. I found out in my race, and I found it in every political race, they change very radically between 6 months before election, so I don't put much stock in it at all.
Congressman Hansen has been behind in the polls before and has been able to come out ahead in the past. The man has 9 to 29 political lives, and I don't know which one he's on, but the fact is that I have a great deal of respect for the man as a politician. And even though those numbers look very, very poor, if I were Mr. Stallings, I would keep looking back over my shoulder.
MARCEP has a good reputation for doing accurate polling, and I would expect that within the tolerances of any survey of a relatively small sampling, it's probably an accurate indication early on that George Hansen is in the race of his life for his political life.
Our survey also asked respondents throughout the state about the race for the U.S. Senate. In that one, the incumbent Republican, James McClure, appears to hold a very comfortable lead over challenger Pete Bush of Lewiston. Bush getting at this point only about 25% to McClure's 60%.
How do you feel about those
Let's
figures?
vote. Well, of course I feel good about it, but the election isn't today. The election is next November. That margin is going to narrow.
How do you react to that?
It's great. I'm surprised there's that many people know who I am as yet. The majority of the people I've been speaking to are, people that are pretty much independent thinkers, and I think the poll will certainly go up. The fascinating thing, I believe, is that the McClure only has 60%, which means all he has to do is lose about 10% of support, and he could be in trouble.
We talked a moment ago about how George Hansen did with his own party, which in this survey was not terribly good. How does Jim McClure do with Republicans?
Well, McClure is strong in every segment, and he captures 90% of the Republicans and 25% of the Democrats.
So it's a fairly widespread support that presumably Pete Bush would have some difficulty overcoming.
That's true, and I'd like to point out that McClure shows strength among groups where George Hansen in his race is showing weakness, that is among long-term residents and those reporting above average incomes.
How about this question that was raised in the videotape about the length of time before the election?
Well, that's an accurate comment. We're not trying to predict here what's going to happen in November. What we're doing is taking a snapshot, if you will, of how public opinion, how sentiment was in the 1st of June.
So we intend, we might point out too, to try this again in November when it is much closer
That's
to the election.
true. Mm-hmm.
And that will be measuring a different kind of thing.
Yes.
Let's go on to a couple of final political results before we move on to some other issues. To probably no one's surprise, Idahoans in the survey gave President Reagan a strong edge over a probable Democratic challenger, Walter Mondale, the president getting the nod from almost 2/3 of our sample. And respondents rated Democratic Governor John Evans somewhat higher than they did in our initial survey in January. His 12% now rating his performance as very good and 40% as good.
Maybe it's the summertime. Of course, when the legislature is in session, we have a combatant's role. We're trying to achieve some goals, some programs that we've developed, and there's obviously some reaction, some criticism constantly. So I think it has a tendency to lower your ratings.
Oh, pretty good analysis. I think that the higher ratings for the governor were in large measure due to perhaps lower visibility during this season and when the legislature's not in town.
Anything outstanding about those?
Well, not really. His strength in southern Idaho, especially southeastern Idaho, that's nothing new, I don't think. And one thing is that there's more polarization among those who are in the 55 years of age and older group. They give him the highest percentage on both the very good and the poor ratings.
Does that have something, oh, and the poor also, not just the very
That's
good.
right. So there's more polarization among that group. The 4 out of 10 Republicans give him a good rating, so I think that's good for the governor.
Let me go back to the president's race for a moment. We saw that result a moment ago. President Reagan does pretty well virtually everywhere, does he not?
Yes, he does, and really there's not a whole lot of news in the presidential race except to say that in fact, Hart polls better than Mondale against the president. Hart polls 35% against Mondale's 23%.
So for this state, he might have been the stronger candidate.
Oh, that's
right
clearly
now.
true. In fact, in North Idaho, Hart leads the president in the North by 57 to 35%.
The president did fairly well among younger voters, did he not?
Yes, he did, and this is perhaps a surprise, but Reagan is strongest among younger Idahoans, and this partly is a function of where each party gains its strength. That is, Republicans tend to be younger than Democrats in Idaho.
Just very briefly, did we see the much talked about gender gap here, where women don't like the president as much?
There's no sign of a significant gender gap in Idaho. Reagan versus Mondale. Reagan polls 66% with men, and among women it's 61%, so not much of a difference.
Nothing significant.
Not at all.
Thank you. Wilderness is a controversial issue in this state, and perhaps at no time more than right now. The U.S. Senate has already passed, and the House is in the middle of hearings on a bill the state's congressional delegation calls a good compromise. But a lot of Idahoans don't see it that way. Our survey found a populace badly split on the issue. We asked respondents first whether they favored or opposed adding more land to the existing wilderness in Idaho. By a slim majority, they favored at least some additions, 47% taking that position, 43% saying no more. 10% said they hadn't made up their minds. We then asked the people who did favor more wilderness how much more they favored. 13% of that group favored 526,000 acres. That's the amount proposed by the congressional delegation. 15% agreed with Governor John Evans that another 1.2 million acres should be protected. More than 30% voted for a 1.7 million acre wilderness, a position supported by the Idaho Department of Fish and Game. And 24% of those who do want more wilderness chose the highest figure given them, 3.35 million acres, that proposed by the Idaho Wildlands Defense Council. Idaho Senator James McClure was the man most responsible for the delegation's much lower proposal of about 500,000 new acres.
Well, I think the survey shows what is no news to me at all, and that is there's a great division of opinion among Idahoans. Certainly, one survey doesn't say all. I've forgotten exactly how many surveys we've had over the last 10 years that have been remarkably uniform in their attitudes. And I've said all along that certainly a generalized attitude that says about wilderness generally doesn't say what they feel about a particular area. That's likely to be different. But it does, once again, confirm the fact that Idahoans are not all of one mind.
But wilderness supporters say McClure and others have often claimed that most Idahoans oppose any new additions.
Well, I'm very pleased. You know, we've heard from our congressional delegation that the people of the state of Idaho in their polls indicated they didn't want any increased wilderness at all. It indicates from your particular poll that 47% of the people want wilderness, 43% do not want any more wilderness, and 10% is undecided. Well, gee, that indicates to me that that we're going to be able to comfortably support on a political basis. Comfortably support an increase in wilderness somewhere in the level of which I've made recommendations on.
This survey proves what we've been saying all along, and that's that the majority of Idahoans do not oppose more wilderness designation. In fact, your survey shows that a plurality of Idahoans favor more wilderness designation.
We've maintained all along that the numbers that have been quoted by Senator McClure recently have not been correct. And I think it verifies our stand. I think there are more people that favor wilderness in the state than oppose it. So I guess I feel good about the fact that it sort of verifies the fact that there are a lot of sportsmen, among other folks in the state, that really do want more wilderness because of its values to wildlife.
Wilderness proponents don't seem disturbed that a lot of Idahoans, even if not a majority, do oppose them.
You can look at it in that point of view, or in the light that there's 48% that favor additional wilderness, and that includes McClure's bill, but his is the least popular proposal of any wilderness proposal, and I think it just says it's lousy legislation, and people of Idaho don't want it. They want more and something better.
I assure you that when I'm out, people come up to me and they don't say, well, I'm just in favor of wilderness. They come up and say, I'm opposed to it. And I talk to them and I say, why? What areas? And before long you find out that a great majority of those 43% are against the concept of wilderness, but they're conservationists when it comes to their area that they want protected. So I think even if the question had been asked to those people that oppose wilderness, what about specific areas? Where do you live and where do you hunt? And in that area, do you favor wilderness or not? I think you would have found out that 43% would have split dramatically the other way also.
43% one way, 47% the other way. Can we really tell who's got the majority in this situation?
Well, Gene, we have to be careful in reviewing the statistics on this one. What we can say with a high degree of certainty is that Idahoans are nearly split down the middle on whether or not to add more wilderness. Although 47% of those in our survey favor adding more and 43% oppose, the results are too close to confirm a statistically significant difference within a reasonable level of certainty. But there are some things we can say. Again, they are split on the issue. It's clearly a north-south issue which seems to transcend party affiliation.
With the North generally opposing additional wilderness?
Yes, that's true. And since the typically Democratic North shows a plurality opposing additional wilderness, yet Democrats statewide favor additional acreage by 52 to 41%. And then it's all...
So the Democrats in the North don't necessarily go along with their political counterparts in the South?
That's correct. It's also a generation gap issue. Older citizens, especially those over 55, oppose more wilderness by a 2-to-1 margin, and those under 35 favor wilderness by nearly 3-to-1.
So there's some justification for the statement that it really is the younger people in Idaho who are after the wilderness.
Oh, it definitely is. It's a strong margin. And again, the polarity of opinion by age transcends party affiliation. So what best predicts how one might feel about wilderness will be determined by a person's age and where they live.
We did see, though, did we not, among people who did want more wilderness, quite a bit of strength for more, for example, than the governor has proposed?
Yes, we saw that 55%, I believe, were favoring 1.7 million or more of those who did favor more wilderness.
This is an issue we may well have to look at again.
Yes.
Plans call for this survey to be repeated at regular intervals. Some of the subject matter will differ, but we will repeat certain so-called tracking questions, questions used to measure changes in public opinion over time. A couple of those questions already have shown some perceptible shifts. The economy continued to dominate respondents' concerns, but both education and taxes declined in importance over the 6-month interval as respondents named a greater variety of problems they think are important. They were also less sure that the economy now is better than it was a year ago. In January, more than 40% said it was. This month, only a third think so. Almost half say things are about the same. How about that reaction to the economy? What does that tell you about how people are perceiving the recovery and where it is?
Well, viewpoints regarding the economic conditions clearly have shifted, as you pointed out. The majority view is now that we are in a period of stability rather than growth. And, but yet they see that things are getting neither better nor worse, rather than actually a negative view. There's more optimism in Ada County than elsewhere, and optimism has dropped off substantially in the Pocatello and Magic Valley area, but it's not particularly negative.
Thank you. For some final reaction tonight, we'll go back to the Republican convention at Sun Valley. Here's Mark Johnson.
It would be an understatement to say that Republicans are worried about Congressman George Hansen's re-election chances. And the numbers in this latest Idaho Opinion Survey would only seem to enhance the level of that worry, at least among Republican Party officials. Hansen's situation and his re-election chances is certainly the topic of conversation paramount as the Republicans gather here in Sun Valley this weekend. For some political analysis of these latest poll numbers, I'm joined tonight by Rod Grammer, who's the political editor of the Idaho Statesman newspaper in Boise, and Jim Fisher, who covers politics for the Lewiston Morning Tribune from Lewiston. Rod, as you look at the Hansen and Stallings numbers, are they surprising to you that Stallings has that sort of a lead?
Yes, Mark, I'd say there's about a 30% spread between them, and I'm not surprised that Stallings is ahead, but I am surprised at the spread in that poll.
In the coming as the numbers did before even the latest bad publicity for the congressman, maybe that's even more surprising.
Yeah, I talked to some county chairmen earlier this week, and they indicated that they've even noticed a dip in his support since his sentencing. So if that poll had been taken about a week later, the margin could be even greater.
I'm right to say that Republicans are worried about this, aren't I, Jim?
I would think so. Judging from the response that was given today by Party Chairman Dennis Olson at the state convention, which was a rather resounding denunciation of Hansen's opponent, Richard Stallings, and defense of George Hansen's legal position at any rate, I would say that generally reflects some concern.
We don't have any reaction from the congressman. Stallings' reaction was basically that the only poll that counts is Election Day. That's the classic comment about political polls. But I'm wondering if this really helps him. He obviously thinks it helps him in terms of encouraging his workers to really fires them up for as the campaign moves into the summer. How do you think it will affect Hansen's supporters, Rod?
Well, I think it'll fire George's hardcore supporters up because, whenever they're, as George says, their backs are against the wall, they get even more vehement about supporting him. So I think in that regard it will help, but it'll also discourage, I think, a lot of Republicans. Already this morning I've talked to a few and they're discouraged with the results.
How would you guess that would play, Jim?
I'm not sure. I suspect that some Republicans just simply may not vote in that race. I can't imagine that many Republicans are going to want to support a Democrat and to see a House seat that has been Republican go over into the Democratic column. And yet some of the Ada County Republicans especially that I've talked to sound as if that they simply will not vote at all.
You know, Mark, if I could just add one thing. In the poll, I think a significant finding was that Stallings had 37.5% of the Republican vote. And that was very surprising to me, and I think that should be alarming to the Hansen people.
Just in a word, is this convention going to make any move to get George Hansen out of the race, and will these numbers enhance that movement if it even exists, Rod?
I don't think so, Mark. The leaders have been working behind the scenes to try to keep both sides calmed down to avoid any fight, and the Republicans are pretty good at that.
Jim, clearly Jim McClure, it's no surprise that he is as far ahead, I guess, as he appears to be, if we can believe the numbers in this poll. His comment was, let's have the election today, when he saw the results. Realistically, can Pete Bush narrow that?
Oh, well, he certainly has the possibility of doing that, and that, of course, is what he is saying. I don't think that these results would be any surprise to Bush. He admits that he's fighting an uphill battle, and I'm sure his first reaction would probably be, let's have the election in November, and he's going to be working from now and then to narrow that margin.
Do you have any thoughts on that, how that race stands today, Rod?
Well, I think the results are pretty clear there, Mark, and I just think Bush is going to have trouble narrowing those results. That's about what McClure beat Dwight Jensen by in '78, and I don't expect that to change much.
The other major issue in the poll, Jim, were the questions about wilderness and how Idahoans are feeling about that debate. I'm not sure that there's enough in the numbers that almost any position can find something to support their point of view. How do you look at those numbers?
Well, I don't think there's any surprise in the overall split that there are people who think that we need more wilderness. There are people who think that we need less. I think that the one thing that these results do is they put the lie to those people who have been saying that Idahoans feel one way or the other. All Idahoans, or nearly all Idahoans, feel one way or the other. The thing that's interesting, however, is when were asked how many acres they think should be added. You look at those numbers, and it's obvious, I think, that a number of the respondents to the survey simply did not know which acreages meant more, which acreages represented less. So I think there's still some confusion on that issue.
Rod, how do you look at those wilderness numbers?
Well, I think that's right, Mark. McClure has been saying a majority of people oppose wilderness, and I think that at least this survey shows that those figures may not be right, that Idahoans instead are deeply divided on this issue.
Does it surprise you, Jim, that so many people in northern Idaho apparently don't want any more wilderness designated?
Not necessarily. I think that that many of the timber areas of the north have either rightly or wrongly been led to believe that that wilderness means degradation of the number of jobs, and people up there do feel that way. You get out into some of the areas around Orofino, Grangeville, areas like that. You hear a lot of that kind of sentiment.
Is this likely in any way to cut in any of these races this fall, the wilderness question?
Well, Mark, I was just going to make the point that this is really not a partisan issue. You know, the Democrats 2 weeks ago really watered down their wilderness plank. So I think it depends on which part of the state you're talking about. It's certainly in Ada County, wilderness is popular. Certainly in Jim's area, the Democrats are as opposed to it as the Republicans are. So I think what you'll see is the local candidates reflecting their locality's point of view on it.
Maybe the lesson is that Idahoans really are divided on that issue. As
if you wanted to look for any indication, I suppose you'd find it in the Bush-McClure race, because there you definitely do have a choice. Bush clearly says that the McClure proposal is inadequate, and he would like to see more.
That's all the time we have for tonight. I'd like to thank Tom Brown for being with us tonight, and I'd also like to thank he and the entire MARCEP staff for the work they've done on this.
Thank you, Gene.
That is all the time we have for tonight. Be sure to join us on Monday night. We'll have complete coverage of the Republican convention taking place in Sun Valley this weekend. I'm Jean McNeil. Good night.
The funding for this program is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and the Friends of 4, 10, and 12.